We will be analyzing a chess game played by Capablanca, and this game is a really good lesson in how to use a space advantage in chess. Almost nobody talks about this, but this is so very important to learn. So make sure that you pay attention, take notes if you have to, and watch the entire video. So Capablanca was playing this game here with the black pieces. And in this particular game, Capablanca played the Caro-Kann defense, which actually he almost never played this, but the opening itself here is not really that important. It's mostly going to be the middle game where we are going to learn our very valuable lessons. So for those of you that don't know the Caro-Kann defense, we basically start with c6 so that we can play d5, and this is a way that we can challenge the center, and if white were to take, we can always just recapture. We have a very equal, very basic, boring position, I would say, which is exactly what Capablanca likes to play. But in this game, that did not happen. White played pawn to e5, the advanced variation, because they advanced the pawn here to e5. This opening allows white to play a very crucial move, which is bishop to f5. We play bishop to f5 because we are going to be building a pawn pyramid. A pawn pyramid in the center, and this pyramid will have all pawns on the light squares, which means our light squared bishop will be an incredibly bad piece if it's still stuck here on the starting square. So that's why it's important that we develop this first. White plays bishop to d3, which chess.com says this is a book move. I feel like this is a bit of a strange move to make. The reason why is this bishop here is what I call our bad bishop. It's our bad bishop because almost all of our pawns will be on light squares. So this bishop is very limited in mobility. For the opponent, this bishop is a very good bishop because all of their pawns will be on dark squares. So that bishop has a lot of diagonals to use. But they are giving us a trade where we can give away the bad bishop and they give away their good bishop. Doesn't make that much sense if you ask me. Capablanca plays e6, completing the pyramid, and now you see that we are very happy that that light squared bishop is already gone and traded. All right, and white plays knight to e2. And in this position, the usual plan for black is to try to fight against these two central pawns, which we can do with moves like c5, knight c6, and also queen b6. Those are the basic moves, and then you can even do other knight maneuvers to get even more pieces, especially attacking this d4 pawn. So Capablanca starts with the move queen b6, which nowadays it's not played that much anymore, but it does make sense. The queen is useful here, attacking this pawn, and it also limits your opponent here from developing this bishop, because if they ever move it, well, they would be dropping this pawn. So this is in a way hindering white and their development. Okay, white just continues with castling, and then here Capablanca plays c5, which I think it's a very logical move to play. It could have even been played earlier instead of the queen move. And why do we play this move? We play this move because we want to fight against the center. Chess.com engine says it's maybe not the right time for this. There could be some counterplay with c4, but I won't go super in depth. I think the move makes sense opening wise. We are trying to fight for the center. White does the logical move. Their center is being attacked, so they protect it. And of course, by moving the pawn up one square, we have the c6 square for the knight, which is very important. We already talked about this. And white plays f4, which in a way it's very logical. I mean, white is just going to put all of their pawns on the dark squares and try to really control the center. That's what we talked about from the beginning. But of course, the problem with this type of strategy is that they have a dark squared bishop. And that bishop is really not such a good piece in this position because it barely has any diagonals that it can use. It basically, yeah, it's very limited to only two squares. And even then, it's still stuck on those squares. And there was not an immediate reason to play f4, but it's also not anything huge. Capablanca plays pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4, and this helps us because this opened up a file, and black will very easily be able to put a rook on this file, and it's not going to be so easy for white to fight back. And this is something that you really have to look out for in your own games as well. If you can create an open file, with that I always mean a file where your own pawn has been removed, so it's an open file for us, you can get a rook there and the opponent cannot easily get a rook there, then that's always going to be a strategic advantage. So that is a very nice move here. We still need to develop some of our pieces. I mean, these pieces are still stuck. Sometimes in these openings, it can be a bit of a struggle. I mean, if you put the bishop here, you block the knight. If you put the knight here, you block the bishop. You always need to do some maneuvering. And Capablanca has the move knight to h6 here, which usually you don't want to play this. A knight on the edge is not so good, and also white could take it with the bishop. But because of that pawn on f4, this knight is perfectly fine, and we will be able to maneuver it in the future. White is trying to develop as well. Knight to d2 makes sense, and then black plays knight to f5. And this is what we talked about in the beginning, how all of our pieces are working together to attack this one pawn on d4. That's the main opening strategy here. And this pawn is actually attacked 3 times. It's only protected 2 times, so white has to add an extra defender to this pawn, otherwise they lose it. So all of this makes sense. I feel like here we are finally almost done with the opening, and this is the moment where we are going to start talking about the space advantage. So Capablanca plays h5, and this is really the first move where we are going to start to see a space advantage. First, I have to explain what does that actually mean, a space advantage. It means that our pieces have more squares, and with pieces I mean knights, bishop, queen, not the pawns. Our pieces have more squares, and our opponent's pieces barely have any squares. And you can create a space advantage by pushing pawns up the board, because every time you push the pawn further up the board, you are taking away more options from the opponent. h5 is already a good move here. We take away that g4 square, which also makes it impossible for them to really challenge this knight. So the knight will be very well placed here for the rest of the game, and this also takes away at least 1 square from the opponent. And white is already struggling a bit. I mean, this bishop is already not that good, as we talked about, so they move it, but it's not really helping. And Capablanca plays the move a5, yet another move that increases the space advantage. So I actually have a 3-step strategy, and it's even worth writing this down. And you can follow this 3-step strategy whenever you notice that you can have a space advantage. So step 1 is always to grab more space. That's always the first thing you want to do, which is what Capablanca is doing here. He pushes these two pawns, he grabs more space, which means take away more squares from the opponent. That's what I mean when I say grab more space. Then the second step we want to do is we want to optimize our pieces, meaning we have more squares for the pieces, so we want to use those squares to put the pieces in the best possible configuration so they are well coordinated. That's step 2. And then step 3 is open up the position by doing a pawn break. And we are going to see 1, 2, 3, all of these steps in this game. So this was step 1. We are grabbing space. We are controlling squares and the opponent's position here. I also have to talk a little bit about the fact that, yes, there was a pawn here for free, but the b2 and b7 pawns, they are often poison, meaning if you take them, you can run into trouble, your queen gets attacked, the rook infiltrates, grabs that pawn. It's a mess. We don't want to go for this. Capablanca is smart enough to not fall for any of these basic traps. So a5. White counters with a3, which makes some sense. They are trying to also prevent us from putting a piece there. So we already achieved step 1. We have space and we pushed some pawns. There is not really any extra way that we can try to gain even more space here, because gaining more space would mean pushing more pawns. And like if we push this one, we lose the g4 square. If we push this one, we lose the b4 square. For example, this would not be good. We would be giving back that square to them. So we cannot do anything for step 1. There is no more space to be gained. So now we have to optimize pieces. Capablanca plays a very interesting move here, queen to a6, which it basically forces a queen trade. It attacks the queen, and the queen cannot really move, because if the queen moves somewhere, of course, not this, that would be a mouse slip blunder, but this, you would get a free knight. And if they try to protect the queen, they have a problem. There are actually some problems here, but the biggest problem is that this center is falling apart. We can take this, they take this, and then we have bishop to c5, pinning the knight, and we will be winning that knight as well. It's a little bit complicated, but basically here we are threatening to win that central pawn, because as soon as one of the defenders is gone, we can sacrifice, we can activate the bishop on c5, and we will be winning back the piece that we sacrificed, and we are just going to be up a pawn, and their position will be destroyed. So trading queens is pretty much the only thing they can do, which that is great for us, because their queen was actually one of their best active pieces. Now it's gone, and it also helps us to get the rook into the game. Maybe we will slide the rook over somewhere to the left as well. Okay, so white grabs the open file, and Capablanca plays a very smart move here that you should also try to play in your own games. Black hasn't castled yet, but castling is not so important here. I have this rule that if the queens are off the board and the center is closed, meaning there are pawns there that are locked, they cannot move, they are locked, then you don't need to castle. You can literally keep your king in the center. So king to d7, smart. This protects a couple of squares, and it will make it easier to eventually get our pieces into play as well. White realizes that, look, white is in a very bad position, because this bishop not doing anything, both of the knights are incredibly passive. They have to always keep an eye on this pawn on d4. So yeah, they can barely do anything. This pawn is under attack. The knights are very passively placed. The bishop is passively placed. The bishop cannot help protecting the pawn here, because that's also a square we control. That's the space advantage. We are controlling a lot of squares in their position. So basically the only thing that white can really try to do is play on the c file. That's the only attempt that they have. So they play this so that they can double up the rooks. Capablanca moves the bishop, which makes a lot of sense, because of course we also want to get this rook into the game. And from here, when you have a space advantage, the beauty is that you can pretty much almost do whatever you want, because your opponent is just out of moves. Yes, white just doubled the rooks, but that's it. White doesn't have anything. The knights cannot move, the bishop cannot really move, and the rooks, yes, they are doubled, but what does that matter? They are just looking at a knight that's protected twice. So basically from this point forward, white has no moves, and black can do whatever they want. And that's the beauty with the space advantage. So we are going to see a lot of maneuvering here. If you were thinking about other maneuvering moves, they probably work as well. There is just so much we can do. The game starts with Capablanca playing bishop to d8, which is smart, because we can get the bishop to b6. And by getting the bishop to b6, we are now having 3 attackers on this pawn. So that increases the problems for white, because they have to defend. They could go bishop c3, but if they defend with bishop c3, look at this advantage. I mean, not only the knights and the bishops are stuck, but the bishop also blocked in the 2 rooks. So white literally doesn't have a single move that they can play for the rest of the game. They are just so stuck. They have no space. They have no squares. Instead, white saw this coming, so they played king f2, so that they can play bishop to e3 to protect this pawn. All right. So looking at this position, we always have to think through the 3 steps from the space advantage. So step 1 is that we always need to grab more space, grab more squares in their position if we can. That was not really possible before, but right now it is possible again. We can play a4, which this advance takes away yet one more square from the opponent. And giving up the control of b4, which I mentioned before that was not smart, because they could maybe put a bishop there or something. Well, the bishop is not controlling it. And of course, if they try to go back, well, we always have 3 attackers on this pawn, and white can simply not move. So literally these three pieces are just stuck. They cannot do anything for the rest of the game. So a4 just works. And this is the moment, doesn't matter what the engine says here, white has nothing. Like this move is reasonable because white has nothing. And black can just optimize. Rook c8 is the best move. I don't know why there is a question mark there. Rook c8, of course, we are activating our rook here as well. And white is trying to somehow untangle the pieces. They are using this rook now as a passive defender so that maybe their knight can be active. But even this knight has no future because there are still no squares the knight can go to. They are just out of squares. That's the space advantage. So we are still in step 2. We are still optimizing our pieces, and this step can take quite a while. And it is very important during the optimization step that we don't start trading pieces. We basically just want to keep improving our pieces to the best possible squares. We don't want to trade pieces because every trade is good for the opponent because their pieces are bad, our pieces are good, and if we trade, we help them get rid of those bad pieces. So we just want to optimize. Knight a5 is a very genius move because of course the knight can optimize towards these two squares, and no, that pawn is not free because that rook would be free. So they cannot take it. All right, and white is out of moves. It doesn't matter. This is not really a mistake in my opinion. They just have no moves. That's just the whole point of the space advantage. So we need to optimize this knight. And Capablanca played at knight c4, which it looks logical, but it's actually not the best move in this position. This takes away this square from white, but they already didn't really have that square. We also got a little bit of control over these two squares, but that doesn't matter too much. Knight to b3 would have actually been better, because suddenly we are grabbing even more squares in the opponent's position, squares that we didn't have control of before. And that's what you want to do. You want to keep attacking squares in their position, because now these rooks are just stuck. Like this rook, for example, it cannot go anywhere. Those squares are attacked by the knight, and the knight cannot go anywhere. Otherwise, this rook drops, and yeah, they are just out of moves. So this would have been even slightly better than the move that Capablanca played. And of course, this also blocks in our own rook a little bit. So could have been a little bit better there. White just retreats with the bishop because of course that bishop is attacked twice. So yeah, they do need to do something with it. But you can see how they are really struggling, and Capablanca is just taking his time, slowly improving the pieces. The bishop is not needed anymore here. We can just move it back. We can go to different diagonals. We can keep maneuvering. And there is so much maneuvering here. I don't have to go super deep for every move. But basically, we have come to a point right here where our pieces are optimized. Our knights are incredibly well placed. Would be a little bit better if it was there. Our rooks are active. They can double up at any point. And the bishop is somewhat waiting. It's looking at this side and this side at the same time, so it can control whatever side of the board is necessary for us to win. So step 1, take more space. Step 2, optimize the pieces. Step 3, break open the position. And that is what we are going to see now. b5. Capablanca finds a pawn break, and a pawn break is basically a pawn exchange that we can try to ignite, which is going to open up files and diagonals. And Capablanca is looking at the pawn break pawn to b4, which would open up the position. It's logical to go for this one because, well, we have two rooks, a knight, and a potentially passed pawn on this side of the board. Other pawn breaks that you could look at would be something like f6, but playing these moves also opens up new squares for the opponent. And you want to be careful that when you go for a pawn break, when you open up the position, that you do it in a way that it activates your well-coordinated pieces even more without activating the opponent's pieces, or at least trying to limit activating their pieces. So b5 makes sense. And white is desperate at this point. They don't have anything. They tried g4 because they are trying to get some play on some side of the board. Doesn't matter, something somewhere. That's really what they want. But yeah, h5 takes g4. That's why we had this here. Rook takes g4, but This rook is also out of play. It cannot go here, it cannot go here, it cannot go here, it cannot take the pawn, and it cannot go here. So basically the only thing the rook can do is go back. So this looks like the rook was optimized for them. Not true, that rook is a terrible piece. So it's finally time for the most important moment and the most important part of this game. Step 1 and 2 are complete. We go for step 3. Open up the position. Pawn to b4. This is a very good move. A lot of things could happen here. I'll just continue with what happened in the game, which is that they take, Capablanca takes, and you can see our pieces are becoming even more active, while the opponent is just struggling to do anything at all. White plays knight to d1, and we just have a completely winning position here. There are so many ways to play this, but what we want is we want to keep improving pieces, and eventually we are going to do the same. We are going to improve pieces again. We are going to see if we can grab even more space, meaning attack more squares, and then we will do another pawn break, which will be a3. So it's literally even just repeating step 1, 2, 3 multiple times in the game. If you can, this is like the perfect example of this. So rook to c6 makes sense. The rook is helping here protect the knight, also potentially challenging this rook. White is trying to start some play here on this side of the board, which Capablanca played g6 to set up this structure, which also frees up the knight. Because as long as this rook is here, the knight is a bit more passive. By playing g6, we stop the pawn push, because, well, if they push the pawn, we take the pawn, and it also frees up the knight. So that's just a good move for us in general. And white is shuffling, white is struggling. And here we will have the final breakthrough, which is going to win the game. There is a winning sequence here for black. It starts with knight takes d2. Everything is open. We have the rooks here ready. We have the pawn that's 3 squares away from promotion. So it's time to open up everything. Knight takes bishop. Rook takes knight. And then here the beautiful move, rook to b3. Check. And it's game over. White moves the king. And at this point, Capablanca plays a move after which the opponent instantly resigns. Bishop to a5. And bishop to a5 wins the game. It attacks the rook. And because of the space advantage that we have, they are just struggling so much. Of course, the rook cannot go here. It would be captured for free. If the rook goes here, we have a check. And that forces them to basically move the king to this square and also let go of the rook. So the rook is just trapped. The rook is just trapped. And this is what happens when you have a space advantage. At some point, the opponent's pieces will be so badly coordinated that they start tripping over each other and they just run out of squares. And yeah, that's what happens here. They are running out of squares. This is game over. The only move that you might consider for white would be knight to c3, because knight to c3 stops the problem because the rook is no longer under attack. Well, it also loses because you can take. We have 2 rooks, incredible pressure, and we have a passed pawn. And there is an even more brilliant move here. Incredible. Pawn to a3. And yes, they cannot capture us, otherwise the knight drops because that pawn was protecting that knight. So what do? I'm not sure. Let's say that they move a rook. Oh no, then they lose a pawn as well. So they literally have no moves. Let's say that they activate this rook. Well, now we take. The knight is attacked 3 times. And we have a pawn that is going to promote. It's just game over. So this was a huge lesson in space advantages. I hope this helped you out. Make sure to subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.